Sarah Martinez thought she knew what rock bottom looked like. Stranded on a desolate highway outside Bakersfield, California, with nothing but the clothes on her back and bruises that told a story she was too ashamed to speak, she watched car after car pass her by. For 3 hours, dozens of people saw her there, bleeding, desperate, holding a cardboard sign that simply read, "Please help." They all looked. They all drove past, until a dusty pickup truck with Montana plates pulled over, and a weathered rancher named Jake Thompson stepped out. What he did next would shatter everything Sarah thought she knew about human nature, and set in motion a chain of events so extraordinary that even she couldn't have imagined it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October sun beat down mercilessly on Interstate 5, creating shimmering heat waves that distorted the endless stream of vehicles rushing past. Sarah Martinez sat on the gravelly shoulder, her back against a rusted guardrail, watching the world speed by at 70 miles per hour. Her left eye was swollen shut, a grotesque purple that matched the fingerprint bruises around her neck. Her white tank top, once pristine, now bore dark stains that could have been oil, blood, or both. The cardboard sign beside her had been torn from a discarded box behind a gas station. In a shaky black marker, she'd written just 2 words: "Please help, simple, desperate, honest." It was 2:47 p.m. when she'd first taken her position on this godforsaken stretch of highway. She knew the exact time because she'd checked her cracked phone screen compulsively, watching the minutes crawl by like hours. By now, that same phone was dead, its battery drained from her frantic attempts to call anyone who might care enough to answer. 3 hours. That's how long she'd been sitting there. 3 hours of watching humanity reveal its true face. The first car that passed was a silver BMW with tinted windows. Sarah had stood up, waving her sign hopefully, but the luxury sedan had actually accelerated as it approached her, as if her desperation might be contagious. Through the windshield, she'd caught a glimpse of a woman in designer sunglasses, deliberately looking away, her manicured hand reaching for the radio dial. The second was a family minivan. Soccer ball stickers decorated the rear window, and she could see children's faces pressed against the glass, pointing at her with curious innocence. The mother in the passenger seat had turned around sharply, snapping at the kids to stop staring. The van's brake lights never even flickered. Then came the parade of indifference. A red pickup truck with a "Support Our Troops" bumper sticker. A Honda Civic with a "Coexist" symbol on the back. A massive RV pulling a boat, the American flag snapping proudly in the wind. An old Cadillac driven by a woman who looked like someone's grandmother. A brand new Tesla that probably cost more than Sarah had made in the past 3 years. Every single one of them saw her. She knew they saw her because she watched their heads turn, watched them slow down just enough to get a good look at the spectacle she'd become. Some even pointed. A few took out their phones, not to call for help, but to take pictures of the crazy woman on the side of the road. But not one of them stopped. Sarah had grown up believing in the fundamental goodness of people. Her grandmother, Elena Martinez, had raised her on stories of neighbors helping neighbors, of communities that rallied around those in need. "Mija," she used to say, "when someone falls down, you help them up. That's what makes us human." Those words felt like a cruel joke now. By 4 p.m., Sarah's throat was raw from thirst and her lips had started to crack. The October heat in California's Central Valley was brutal, easily reaching 95 degrees, and she had no water, no shade, no relief. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, back when she still had a home, still had hope, still had Marcus Rivera. Even thinking his name made her chest tighten with a mixture of rage and fear. 6 months ago, he'd been her knight in shining armor. Charming, successful, generous with expensive gifts and grand romantic gestures. He'd swept her off her feet so completely that she'd ignored every red flag, every warning sign, every concerned word from her friends. The first time he'd grabbed her wrist too hard, He'd apologized with tears in his eyes and a diamond bracelet. The first time he'd called her worthless, he'd blamed it on work stress and surprised her with a weekend in San Francisco. The first time he'd hit her, he'd sworn on his mother's grave that it would never happen again. But it did happen again, and again, and again, until last night when she'd finally found the courage to tell him she was leaving. That's when she'd learned what Marcus was truly capable of. That's when she'd discovered that the man she'd loved was a monster who'd systematically isolated her from everyone who might have helped her escape. He'd taken her car keys, her credit cards, her identification. He'd smashed her laptop and thrown her purse into the pool. Then he'd beaten her worse than ever before, his fists connecting with her ribs until she could barely breathe. When she'd tried to crawl away, he'd dragged her back by her hair, his voice eerily calm, as he explained exactly what he'd do to her if she ever tried to leave him again. But Sarah had learned something about herself that night. She'd learned that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. While Marcus slept off his rage and whiskey, she'd slipped out through the bathroom window, wearing nothing but the clothes on her back. She'd run barefoot through the darkness for 3 miles until she'd reached this highway, where she'd thought, naively, stupidly, that someone would help her. Now, watching her 127th car drive past without even slowing down, she was beginning to understand a harsh truth about the world. People didn't want to get involved. They didn't want to dirty their hands with someone else's problems. They had their own lives, their own schedules, their own comfortable bubbles of denial about the suffering that existed just outside their peripheral vision. A state trooper had even driven by around 3:30. Sarah had waved frantically, her heart leaping with hope. Surely a police officer would stop. Surely someone whose job was to protect and serve would see a battered woman in distress and offer assistance. But the patrol car had cruised past at exactly the speed limit, the officer's eyes fixed straight ahead as if she were invisible, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. Sarah felt something inside her beginning to break. Not her bones. Marcus had already taken care of those. Not her spirit. That had been crushed hours ago. Something deeper, something fundamental about her faith in humanity itself. She thought about her grandmother's stories, about the kindness of strangers, and the goodness that supposedly lived in every human heart. She thought about all the movies she'd watched where the hero always appeared just when hope seemed lost. She thought about every fairy tale that promised rescue would come if you just believed hard enough. All lies. The truth was sitting right here on this burning hot asphalt, surrounded by broken glass and discarded cigarette butts. The truth was that people were selfish, scared, and cruel. The truth was that suffering was entertainment, not a call to action. The truth was that she could die right here, right now, and tomorrow's traffic would simply drive around her corpse without missing a beat. A group of teenagers in a modified Honda had slowed down around 5 p.m., windows down, music blasting. For a moment, Sarah had felt a flicker of hope. Young people were supposed to be idealistic, compassionate, willing to take risks that older generations wouldn't. Instead, they'd laughed. Actually laughed at her misery. One of them had even thrown an empty soda can that bounced off her shoulder, while another had shouted something crude about her appearance. They'd sped away in a cloud of exhaust and cruelty, their laughter echoing in the hot air long after they'd disappeared over the next hill. That's when Sarah had truly understood what rock bottom felt like. It wasn't the beating. It wasn't being trapped in an abusive relationship. It wasn't even being homeless and penniless on a dangerous highway. Rock bottom was the moment when you realized that you were completely, utterly, devastatingly alone in a world full of people. By 5:45 p.m., as the traffic began to thin with the approach of evening, Sarah had stopped looking up when she heard engines approaching. She'd stopped waving her sign. She'd stopped hoping. Instead, she sat with her head in her hands, trying to figure out how someone's life could unravel so completely in such a short span of time. 6 months ago, she'd been Sarah Martinez, assistant manager at a boutique marketing firm in Los Angeles. She'd had her own apartment, a reliable car, a small but close circle of friends, and dreams of eventually starting her own agency. She'd been independent, confident, and successful in her own modest way. Now she was nobody, a ghost haunting the side of a highway, invisible to everyone except as a momentary curiosity to gawk at from the safety of their vehicles. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had worked in marketing. Her job had been understanding human psychology, figuring out what motivated people to take action. She'd spent years crafting messages designed to make strangers care about products they'd never heard of, to convince them to open their wallets for things they didn't really need. But she couldn't craft a message compelling enough to make a single person care about her life. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the roadway, Sarah began to seriously consider walking into traffic. Not because she wanted to die exactly, but because she couldn't figure out any other way to make the pain stop. At least then someone would have to stop. At least then she wouldn't be invisible anymore. She was contemplating this dark turn when she heard the rumble of an engine slowing down behind her. Different from the others somehow. Deeper, more purposeful. The vehicle was actually decelerating, its brakes squealing slightly as it pulled onto the shoulder. Sarah didn't look up. She'd been disappointed too many times already. Probably just someone having car trouble, or maybe a driver who'd pulled over to make a phone call. In a minute or two, they'd finish whatever they were doing and merge back into traffic, leaving her alone again with her despair. But then she heard a truck door slam, followed by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Getting closer, someone was actually walking toward her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After nearly 4 hours of being treated like a piece of roadside debris, someone was actually finally approaching her. Sarah lifted her head slowly, squinting against the setting sun. The figure walking toward her was silhouetted against the orange sky, making it impossible to make out details. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the easy confidence of someone who spent their life doing physical work. As he got closer, she could see he was an older man, maybe late 50s, with graying hair beneath a well-worn cowboy hat. His jeans were faded but clean, and his boots had the kind of scuffs that came from honest work rather than fashion. His pickup truck behind him was dusty white, with Montana license plates and a horse trailer attached. He stopped about 10 feet away from her, close enough to talk, but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. His eyes, pale blue and weathered around the edges, took in her condition without flinching. No judgment, no disgust, no fear. Just assessment, like a veterinarian examining an injured animal. "You hurt?" he asked simply. His voice was gravelly but gentle, with the slight drawl of someone who'd spent his life in open spaces rather than crowded cities. Sarah stared at him, momentarily unable to speak. After hours of being ignored, the simple human acknowledgement of her existence felt surreal. She tried to answer, but her voice cracked from disuse and dehydration. "Water," she managed to whisper. Without hesitation, the man turned and walked back to his truck. He returned with a bottle of water, still cold from what must have been a cooler in his cab. He held it out to her, and when she reached for it with shaking hands, he noticed her wedding ring was missing, leaving just a pale band of skin around her finger. Sarah drank greedily, the cold water like salvation flowing down her parched throat. She'd never tasted anything so perfect in her entire life. "Thank you," she gasped between gulps. The man nodded and sat down on his heels, bringing himself to her eye level. Up close, she could see the deep lines in his face, carved by decades of sun and wind. His hands were calloused and scarred from ranch work, but they moved with surprising gentleness as he gestured. "I'm Jake," he said. "Jake Thompson. And you look like someone who's had about the worst day imaginable." Something in his tone, not pity, not curiosity, just simple human recognition, broke through the wall Sarah had built around her heart. For the first time since this nightmare began, Tears started flowing down her cheeks. Not the desperate, panicked tears she'd cried while running from Marcus, or the angry, frustrated tears she'd shed during her first hour on this highway. These were different. These were the tears of someone who had been seen, finally and truly seen, by another human being. They all just... she started, then stopped, gesturing weakly at the road where cars continued to pass. No one would... I know, Jake said quietly. I saw. Those 3 words hit her like a physical blow. He'd seen, he'd witnessed the parade of indifference, the systematic cruelty of ordinary people going about their ordinary lives while she suffered in plain sight. But unlike all the others, seeing hadn't been enough for him. Seeing had compelled him to act. How long have you been sitting here? He asked. Almost 4 hours. Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 4 hours, he repeated, more to himself than to her. He stood up, looking out at the traffic, and Sarah saw something flash across his features that might have been anger. But when he looked back down at her, his expression was gentle again. Well, he said, extending his hand toward her, I reckon that's about 3 hours and 59 minutes too long. Jake Thompson's calloused hand was steady and warm as Sarah grasped it, allowing him to help her to her feet. Her legs wobbled from sitting in the same position for hours, and sharp pain shot through her ribs where Marcus had kicked her. Jake noticed her wince and instinctively steadied her elbow without making a show of it. Easy there, he said softly. Take your time. Standing upright for the first time in hours, Sarah got a better look at her unlikely rescuer. Jake was tall, probably 6'2", with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from a lifetime spent outdoors. His flannel shirt was rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with old scars, some from barbed wire, others from working with horses. There was something fundamentally solid about him, like an oak tree that had weathered countless storms. His truck was a testament to practical use, rather than vanity. The white paint was faded and chipped, the bed was scratched from hauling feed and equipment, and the bumper bore the dings of real ranch work. But everything about it spoke of careful maintenance and reliability. This wasn't a weekend cowboy's toy truck. This was a working man's lifeline. Where are you headed? Jake asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected she didn't have an answer. Sarah's mouth opened, then closed. Where was she headed? She had no money, no ID, no car, no friends she could call. Marcus had systematically cut her off from everyone who might have helped her, and her family was 3,000 miles away in Florida. Even if she could somehow contact them, how could she explain that the successful, independent woman they thought they knew had become this, a broken, desperate stranger who couldn't even manage to get a single person to help her for 4 hours? I don't know, she admitted, the words falling like stones into the evening air. Jake studied her face, taking in the full extent of the damage Marcus had inflicted. The blackened eye, the bruised throat, the way she held her left arm protectively against her ribs. He'd seen similar injuries before, back when he was married to Linda, back when he'd learned the hard way that some wounds went much deeper than what showed on the surface. You hungry? He asked. The question caught Sarah off guard. When was the last time someone had asked about her basic needs? When was the last time someone had spoken to her like she was human, rather than an inconvenience to be managed? Her stomach answered before she could, growling audibly in the quiet space between them. She pressed her hand against her abdomen, embarrassed. I'll take that as a yes, Jake said, the hint of a smile creasing the corners of his eyes. There's a diner about 20 miles up the road. Nothing fancy, but they serve real food to real people. Sarah hesitated. Getting into a stranger's truck had disaster written all over it. Every safety lesson she'd ever learned screamed against it. But then again, every safety lesson she'd ever learned had also told her that someone would help a woman in distress, that people were fundamentally good, that the system would protect her. Those lessons had proven spectacularly wrong, and there was something about Jake Thompson that felt different from Marcus, different from the parade of indifferent faces that had driven past her. Maybe it was the way he'd approached her slowly, giving her space. Maybe it was how he'd gotten down to her eye level instead of looming over her. Maybe it was simply that he'd stopped when no one else would. "I don't have any money," she said quietly. "Didn't ask if you did," Jake replied. "Asked if you were hungry." Those words hit Sarah harder than any of Marcus's punches ever had. The casual kindness in them, the assumption that her worth as a human being wasn't contingent on what she could pay, the simple recognition that she deserved to eat, it was almost too much to process. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Jake walked around to the passenger side of his truck and opened the door for her. The interior was clean but worn, with bench seats covered in cracked leather that had been carefully repaired with duct tape. A thermos sat in the cup holder, and a well-used road atlas lay open on the dashboard. The radio was tuned to a country station playing low. As Sarah climbed in, she noticed a photo tucked into the sun visor, a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, wearing a wedding dress from what looked like the 1980s. The woman looked happy, radiant even. But there was something about the way Jake's eyes avoided the photo that suggested this was a story with a sad ending. Jake started the engine, and they pulled back onto the highway. The horse trailer behind them swayed slightly as they merged into traffic, and Sarah could hear the quiet sounds of animals settling in for the journey. Through the truck's rear window, she glimpsed a beautiful Palomino mare watching the world go by with intelligent dark eyes. "That's Honey," Jake said, noticing her interest. "Bought her from a ranch that was going under. Previous owner couldn't afford to keep her anymore, and she was headed for auction. Most horses that go to auction—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. Seemed like she deserved better. There it was again, that fundamental decency that seemed to guide Jake's actions. He rescued horses that nobody else wanted. He stopped for stranded women that everyone else ignored. Sarah was beginning to understand that this wasn't random kindness on Jake's part. This was who he was, fundamentally and completely. The diner Jake had mentioned turned out to be a classic roadside establishment called Mabel's, the kind of place that had probably looked exactly the same for 40 years. Neon signs advertised real coffee and fresh pie, and the parking lot was filled with 18-wheelers and working trucks. Through the windows, Sarah could see truckers and ranch hands hunched over plates of food, the kind of people who worked hard for their money and valued substance over style. Jake parked away from the main entrance, probably to give Sarah some privacy. She caught her reflection in the truck's side mirror and immediately wished she hadn't. Her face looked like she'd been in a car accident. Her hair was tangled and dirty. Her clothes were torn and stained. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who'd been beaten and abandoned. "I can't go in there looking like this," she said, panic creeping into her voice. "People will stare. They'll ask questions." Jake reached behind the bench seat and pulled out a well-worn denim jacket. "This might help," he said, offering it to her. "And there's a restroom around back if you want to clean up first." "I'll wait." The jacket was huge on Sarah's small frame, but it covered the worst of the stains on her shirt and gave her something to hide behind. The fabric smelled like honest work, leather, hay, and the faint scent of horses. It was oddly comforting, like being wrapped in someone else's strength. The restroom was surprisingly clean for a truck stop. Sarah did what she could with paper towels and hand soap, washing the dried blood from her face and trying to tame her hair into something resembling normal. The reflection staring back at her was still a stranger, but at least now she looked human again. When she emerged, Jake was leaning against his truck, checking on Honey through the trailer's side window. The mare had stretched her neck toward him, and he was scratching behind her ears with the kind of gentle attention that spoke of real affection between them. "She's beautiful," Sarah said. "Smart, too," Jake replied. "Sometimes I think she understands more than most people do." He gave Honey one final pat and straightened up. "Ready for some food?" Inside Mabel's, the atmosphere was exactly what Sarah had expected. Working class, friendly, no nonsense. The kind of place where your coffee cup never stayed empty and nobody asked too many questions. The waitress, a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and sensible shoes, showed them to a corner booth without comment on Sarah's appearance. "What'll it be, folks?" she asked, setting down 2 laminated menus that had seen better days. Jake ordered coffee and asked for a few minutes to decide. When the waitress left, he slid the menu across to Sarah. "Order whatever you want," he said simply. "And I mean whatever. You look like you haven't eaten in a while." Sarah stared at the menu, but the words seemed to blur together. When was the last time she'd made a decision about food that wasn't controlled by Marcus? He'd monitored everything she ate, criticized her choices, made her feel guilty for having preferences. The simple act of choosing her own meal felt overwhelming. "I don't know what I want," she admitted. Jake studied her for a moment, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. "The meatloaf's probably good," he said gently. "Comes with mashed potatoes and green beans. Real comfort food," Sarah nodded gratefully. Comfort food! She couldn't remember the last time she'd allowed herself to be comforted by anything. When the waitress returned, Jake ordered for both of them, meatloaf dinners with extra bread and pie for dessert. He also asked for a to-go container and a bottle of water, which struck Sarah as oddly specific, but she didn't question it. While they waited for their food, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Sarah felt like she should explain herself, should tell Jake who she was and how she'd ended up on that highway. But where did you even begin with a story like hers? How did you explain to a stranger that you'd been so thoroughly broken by someone who was supposed to love you that you couldn't even remember who you used to be? "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," Jake said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "But if you want to talk, I'm listening." Something about his tone, patient, non-judgmental, genuinely interested, opened a floodgate Sarah didn't know existed. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or the relief of finally being treated with kindness, or simply the desperate need to be heard by another human being. Whatever it was, she found herself talking. She told him about Marcus, about the gradual escalation from charm to control to violence. She told him about the isolation, how he'd convinced her that her friends were jealous and her family didn't understand their love. She told him about the financial control, how he'd taken over her accounts to help her budget better, and then used that control to trap her. She told him about the promises that always followed the violence, the gifts that were supposed to make up for the bruises, the way he'd convinced her that she was the problem. Jake listened without interrupting, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. Occasionally he'd nod or make a soft sound of understanding, but mostly he just let her talk. When she described the final beating and her desperate escape through the bathroom window, his jaw tightened, but his eyes remained gentle. "How long were you with him?" he asked when she'd finished. 6 months, Sarah said, then immediately felt defensive. "I know that doesn't sound like very long, but 6 months is plenty long enough," Jake cut her off firmly. "Time doesn't matter when someone's hurting you. 1 day is too long." The simple validation of her experience nearly brought Sarah to tears again. Marcus had always minimized the timeline, acting like she was being dramatic about their minor disagreements that had only been going on for a few months. But Jake understood that time wasn't the measure of trauma. Pain was. Their food arrived, and Sarah realized she was ravenous. The meatloaf was exactly what Jake had promised. Simple, hearty comfort food that seemed to warm her from the inside out. She ate with the focused intensity of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days, while Jake ate more slowly, occasionally glancing around the diner with the alert awareness of someone used to watching his surroundings. "Where are you from originally?" he asked between bites. "Tampa," Sarah replied. "My family's still there, but I haven't talked to them in months." Marcus said. She stopped, realizing how foolish her next words would sound. What did Marcus say? "He said they never really liked me anyway, that I was always the black sheep, and they were probably relieved when I moved to California and stopped bothering them." Sarah stared down at her plate. "I believed him. I actually believed that my own family was happier without me." Jake's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "That's what they do," he said quietly. "People like Marcus, they make you forget who you were before them. They make you think you're nothing without them, that nobody else could ever love you or want you around." There was something in his tone that suggested personal knowledge, but Sarah didn't press. Instead, she asked, "How do you know so much about this?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out the diner window at the trucks and cars passing by in the gathering darkness. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My ex-wife, Linda, she went through something similar with her first husband. By the time I met her, she'd been free of him for 2 years, but the damage—" He shook his head. "It took a long time for her to believe she deserved to be treated well. Sometimes I don't think she ever really believed it." Sarah noticed he'd said ex-wife and wondered about the story there, but something in Jake's expression warned her not to ask. Instead, she said, "She was lucky to have someone who understood." "Maybe," Jake said. "Or maybe I just reminded her too much of what she'd lost." Hard to say. After they finished eating, Jake asked the waitress to box up the slice of apple pie he'd ordered. When Sarah looked at him questioningly, he shrugged. "For later," he said. "Long drive ahead." That casual mention of the future, the assumption that there would be a later, that Sarah would still be around to eat pie, hit her with unexpected force. For the past 24 hours, she hadn't been able to see beyond the immediate moment. The idea that there might be a tomorrow, that someone was planning for her comfort in that tomorrow, was almost too much to comprehend. As they prepared to leave Mabel's, Sarah caught Jake putting a $20 bill on the table for what had probably been a $12 meal. The tip was generous by any standard, extravagant for a place like this. When she started to comment, Jake held up a hand. "That waitress probably worked a double shift today," he said. "Probably got kids at home and bills to pay. $20 won't change her life, but it might make her day a little easier." Walking back to the truck, Sarah found herself studying this man who'd appeared in her life like something out of a different century. In a world of people who drove past suffering without a second thought, Jake Thompson stopped. In a culture that valued wealth and status above all else, he measured his worth by how well he cared for others. In an age of cynicism and self-interest, he operated from a place of fundamental decency that seemed almost anachronistic. As they climbed back into the truck, Sarah realized she still had no idea where they were going. Jake had fed her, listened to her story, treated her with more kindness than she'd experienced in months, but they hadn't discussed what came next. The highway stretched ahead of them into the darkness, full of possibilities that both terrified and thrilled her. "Jake," she said as they pulled back onto Interstate 5, "where are we going?" He glanced over at her, and in the dim light from the dashboard, she saw something she couldn't quite identify in his expression. Determination, maybe, or resolve. "Well," he said, "I figure that depends on what you want to do about Marcus." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to face. What did she want to do about Marcus? Run away and hide? Pretend the past 6 months had never happened? Try to rebuild her life from nothing and hope he never found her? Or something else entirely, something unthinkable? Jake's question about Marcus hung in the cab of the truck like smoke from a wildfire, thick, inescapable, and carrying the promise of something that would change everything. Sarah stared out at the dark highway ahead, watching the white lines disappear under their headlights in hypnotic succession. "What do you mean?" she asked finally, though part of her already knew the answer would be something she wasn't prepared for. Jake's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. In the green glow of the dashboard lights, his weathered face looked carved from stone. "I mean, men like Marcus don't just let go. They don't accept defeat. Right now, he's probably tearing apart your apartment looking for clues about where you went. Tomorrow, he'll start calling your work, your friends, anyone who might know where you are." Sarah's chest constricted. She'd been so focused on escaping that she hadn't thought about what would happen after. "But I don't have anywhere to go." "No one to call." He made sure of that. "Exactly," Jake said grimly. "Which means eventually you'll have to surface somewhere. Apply for a job, rent an apartment, use your social security number for something. And when you do, he'll find you." The truck's heater hummed quietly, but Sarah felt cold spreading through her bones. Jake was right. Marcus had money, connections, and a vindictive streak that ran bone deep. He wouldn't just move on and find someone new. He'd hunt her down like a rabid dog, and when he found her, what he'd done to her last night would seem like a gentle warning. So what are you saying? That I should just go back to him? The words tasted like poison in her mouth. Hell no, Jake said with more vehemence than she'd heard from him yet. I'm saying maybe it's time to stop running and start fighting back. Sarah turned to stare at his profile in the darkness. Fighting back? Jake, you don't understand. Marcus isn't just some angry boyfriend. He has lawyers, influential friends, and a spotless reputation. He owns half the politicians in Los Angeles County. If I try to fight him, he'll destroy me. Maybe, Jake acknowledged. Or maybe he's not as untouchable as he wants you to believe. There was something in his tone that made Sarah's pulse quicken. What do you know about Marcus? Jake was quiet for several miles. The only sounds were the rumble of the engine and the rhythmic thump of tires over expansion joints. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested this conversation had been inevitable from the moment he'd pulled over to help her. I know his name is Marcus Rivera. I know he owns 3 luxury car dealerships in the LA area. I know he lives in a gated community in Malibu and drives a black Porsche Cayenne with the license plate Marcus R. Jake paused, glancing over at Sarah's shocked expression. And I know he's been under federal investigation for money laundering for the past 8 months. Sarah's world tilted sideways. How could you possibly know all that? Because, Jake said, pulling off the highway onto a dark exit ramp, Marcus Rivera killed my daughter. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She gripped the door handle as Jake navigated through a small town that seemed to consist of nothing but closed gas stations and empty storefronts. The silence in the truck was deafening, broken only by the sound of honey shifting restlessly in the trailer behind them. Your daughter, Sarah whispered, Amanda Thompson. 23 years old, working as a paralegal at a law firm in Beverly Hills. Jake's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the controlled grief beneath the surface. She was beautiful, smart, had her whole life ahead of her. And she had the misfortune of catching Marcus Rivera's attention at a charity gala 18 months ago. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Oh my God! Amanda was nothing like you, Jake continued, turning onto a gravel road that led into darkness. She was confident, outgoing, the kind of person who never met a stranger. But Marcus worked on her the same way he worked on you. Isolated her from her friends and family, convinced her that we didn't understand their special connection, made her financially dependent on him. The gravel crunched under their tires as they drove deeper into what appeared to be rural farmland. In the distance, Sarah could see the warm glow of a house's windows, but Jake drove past it without slowing. By the time we realized what was happening, Amanda wouldn't take our calls. She'd moved in with Marcus, quit her job, cut ties with everyone who'd ever cared about her. When her mother, my ex-wife Linda, tried to intervene, Amanda told her she never wanted to see her again. Jake pulled to a stop in front of a small cabin that sat by itself in a grove of oak trees. Solar panels glinted on the roof, and a generator hummed quietly in the darkness. This wasn't his main residence, Sarah realized. This was somewhere off the grid, somewhere hidden. We tried everything, Jake said, turning off the engine. Hired private investigators, consulted with domestic violence experts, even contacted the police. But Amanda was an adult, and she insisted she was happy. There was nothing we could legally do. Sarah's mouth was dry. What happened to her? Jake stared out at the dark trees surrounding the cabin. According to the coroner's report, Amanda Thompson died of a drug overdose 13 months ago. Cocaine laced with fentanyl, found alone in Marcus's beach house while he was conveniently out of town on business. But you don't believe that. My daughter never touched drugs in her life. Wouldn't even take aspirin unless she absolutely had to. But the official investigation was perfunctory at best. Marcus had an airtight alibi, and Amanda had been seen at clubs in the weeks before her death, supposedly buying drugs from known dealers. Jake opened his door and stepped out into the cool night air. Sarah followed, her legs unsteady as the full implications of what he'd told her began to sink in. Around them, crickets chirped in the darkness, and she could smell the earthy scent of rich soil and growing things. The federal investigation started after Amanda's death, Jake continued, walking toward the cabin. Turns out Marcus had been using his dealerships to launder money for a Mexican cartel. Amanda found out about it. Her law background made her curious about some documents she'd seen in his home office. She started asking questions. Sarah felt sick, and then he killed her for it. I can't prove it, Jake said, unlocking the cabin door. But I know it. And I've spent the last 13 months learning everything there is to know about Marcus Rivera, waiting for the right opportunity to make him pay. The cabin's interior was sparse but comfortable, a single room with a kitchenette, a bed, 2 chairs, and a desk covered with papers and photographs. But what drew Sarah's attention was the wall above the desk, which was covered with what looked like a detailed investigation board. Photos of Marcus, building blueprints, financial documents, surveillance photos, newspaper clippings, and in the center of it all, a graduation photo of a beautiful young woman with Jake's eyes and a radiant smile, Amanda. You've been planning this for over a year, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Planning, researching, preparing. Jake walked to the desk and picked up a thick folder. I know Marcus's schedule, his habits, his security arrangements. I know about his offshore accounts, his business dealings, his political connections. I know things about him that even the FBI doesn't know yet. Sarah sank into one of the chairs, overwhelmed. Jake, what exactly are you planning to do? Originally, I was going to wait until the federal investigation concluded, then find a way to ensure Marcus got the maximum possible sentence. Maybe arrange for some evidence to surface that would tie him directly to Amanda's death. Jake sat across from her, the folder in his hands. But then I saw you on that highway today, and I realized something. What? Marcus isn't going to stop. There's going to be another Amanda, another Sarah, another woman whose life he destroys for his own entertainment. The federal case might put him away for financial crimes, but it won't address what he really is, a predator who uses his wealth and power to torture women for sport. Sarah's head was spinning. So what are you proposing? Jake opened the folder and spread its contents across the small table between them. Sarah saw surveillance photos of Marcus entering and leaving various locations, detailed floor plans of his Malibu mansion, financial records showing suspicious transactions, and what appeared to be a complete dossier on his daily routines. Tomorrow night, Marcus is hosting a private party at his beach house. High-end clients, political donors, the kind of people who help him maintain his untouchable image. It's the same house where Amanda died, and he hosts these parties every few months like some kind of sick celebration. Sarah studied the photographs, recognizing the house where she'd been a prisoner for 6 months. How do you know all this? I've had someone on the inside for 3 months. Elena Vasquez. She works for the catering company Marcus uses for these events. Her daughter was one of his victims 2 years ago, before Amanda. She's been feeding me information and waiting for the right moment to act. The pieces were starting to come together in Sarah's mind, and she didn't like the picture they were forming. Jake, what exactly are you asking me to do? He leaned forward, his pale blue eyes intense in the cabin's lamplight. I'm asking you to help me expose Marcus for what he really is. In front of his friends, his business partners, his political allies. I'm asking you to help me destroy his reputation so completely that even if he beats the federal charges, he'll never be able to hurt another woman again. Sarah's hands were shaking. And how would we do that? You still have your key to his house, don't you? He never asked for it back, because he never thought you'd have the courage to use it. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her pocket, where the key ring she'd escaped with still sat like a lead weight. She'd forgotten she even had it. During the party, while Marcus is playing the perfect host downstairs, you and I slip into his private office upstairs. I've identified the location of his safe, and I know the combination. Amanda figured it out months before she died and mentioned it in one of her last voicemails to a friend. What's in the safe? Evidence. Records of his money laundering operation, but also personal things. Trophies he keeps from his victims. Photos, videos, personal items. Jake's voice hardened. Including Amanda's engagement ring. The one she was wearing when she supposedly overdosed. The one that mysteriously disappeared from her body before the police arrived. Sarah felt like she was drowning. This is insane, Jake. Even if we could get into the house, even if we found this evidence, what then? We'd be breaking and entering. Anything we found would be inadmissible in court. We're not planning to take it to court, Jake said quietly. We're planning to broadcast it to every person at that party. Elena has arranged for the house's security system to be compromised, and I've prepared a presentation that will display everything on every screen in the house simultaneously. Televisions, computers, even the guests' phones if they're connected to Marcus's Wi-Fi network. The scope of Jake's plan was staggering. This wasn't revenge, this was war. You want to destroy him publicly? Sarah said. I want to make sure that every powerful person who's ever enabled Marcus Rivera knows exactly what kind of monster they've been protecting. I want his political connections to evaporate overnight. I want his business partners to flee like rats from a sinking ship. I want him to become toxic to everyone he's ever counted on. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. In the distance, she could see the lights of the main house, probably belonging to whoever owned this land and was letting Jake use the cabin. Everything about this situation felt surreal, like she'd stumbled into someone else's life. Why me? She asked. You could find another way into the house. You could, because you're not just another victim, Sarah. You're his current victim. You're the living proof of what he does to women. When people see you tomorrow night, see your injuries, hear your story, understand that you literally escaped through a bathroom window to get away from him, they'll know that everything else we reveal is true. Jake joined her at the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. But I won't force you to do this. If you want, I'll drive you to the bus station tomorrow morning and give you enough money to start over somewhere far away. You can disappear, change your name, build a new life. It's not justice, but it's safety. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Running away meant spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, wondering when Marcus would find her. But Jake's plan meant walking back into the lion's den, risking everything on a scheme that could easily go wrong in a dozen different ways. There's something else, Jake said softly. Something I haven't told you yet. Sarah opened her eyes and turned to look at him. Amanda left a video message before she died, hidden it on a secure server with instructions that it should only be released if something happened to her. She knew Marcus was planning to kill her, and she documented everything. The abuse, the money laundering, even her suspicions about other women who died under suspicious circumstances. Sarah's breath caught. Other women? 3 others over the past 5 years, all young, all involved with Marcus, all dead from supposed accidents or overdoses. Amanda started investigating after she found some of their personal items in Marcus's safe. Jake's jaw tightened. She was building a case against him when he killed her. The magnitude of what Jake was telling her settled over Sarah like a shroud. This wasn't just about her, or even about Amanda. This was about stopping a serial killer who used his wealth and connections to hunt women with impunity. Show me the video, Sarah said quietly. Jake walked back to the desk and opened a laptop computer. A few keystrokes later, Amanda Thompson's face filled the screen. She was beautiful, just as her father had described, but her eyes held a haunted quality that Sarah recognized all too well. If you're watching this, Amanda's recorded voice said, then Marcus probably succeeded in killing me. And if that's true, then you need to know that I wasn't his first victim, and I won't be his last. Unless someone stops him. As the video played, Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her. The broken, terrified woman who'd sat on that highway for 4 hours was still there, but she was no longer alone. She was part of something bigger now, something that might actually matter, When the video ended, Sarah turned to Jake with a resolve she hadn't felt in months. "When do we leave for Los Angeles?" Dawn broke grey and cold over the hidden cabin, filtered through marine layer fog that had rolled in from the Pacific during the night. Sarah had barely slept, her mind racing through the impossibilities of what they were planning. Every time she'd closed her eyes, she'd seen Marcus's face, sometimes angry and violent as it had been 2 nights ago, sometimes charming and manipulative as it had been when they first met. Both versions terrified her. Jake was already awake, sitting at the small table with his laptop open and a steaming cup of coffee beside him. He'd traded his ranch clothes for dark jeans and a black sweater, and something about the transformation made him look more dangerous, more purposeful. The gentle cowboy who'd rescued her from the highway was still there, but now she could see the grieving father underneath. The man who'd spent 13 months planning revenge. "Elena's confirmed everything for tonight," he said without looking up from the screen. "Catering setup begins at 4 p.m., guests arrive at 7. Marcus has 37 people on the invitation list. City councilmen, real estate developers, a few Hollywood types. All people with enough influence to make his life very uncomfortable when they learn what he really is." Sarah poured herself coffee from the pot Jake had made, grateful for the warmth spreading through her hands. "What about security?" "2 guards, both from a company Marcus uses regularly. Elena says they usually spend most of the evening in the kitchen eating leftovers and watching football on their phones. Marcus likes to project an image of casual elegance at these parties. Visible. Security would send the wrong message to his guests, the normalcy of drinking coffee and discussing. Logistics felt surreal given what they were planning. Sarah studied Jake's profile as he scrolled through what appeared to be detailed floor plans on his screen. There was something almost military about his preparation, a level of tactical thinking that suggested this wasn't his first time planning something like this. "Jake," she said carefully, "what did you do before you became a rancher?" He glanced up at her, and for a moment she saw something flicker in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, that she'd asked. "Army Corps of Engineers, 22 years, 3 tours overseas, retired as a master sergeant. Spent most of my career planning operations a lot more complicated than breaking into some rich bastard's house." That explained the methodical approach, the attention to detail, the way he seemed to think 3 steps ahead of every potential problem. Jake Thompson wasn't just a grieving father seeking revenge. He was a trained professional who knew how to execute complex missions under pressure. "Is that how you met Linda?" Sarah asked. Jake's expression softened slightly. "Linda was a nurse at the VA hospital where I went for physical therapy after I got hurt in Afghanistan. Shrapnel in my left leg, still gives me trouble when it rains." He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. "She'd been divorced for 2 years when we met, getting back on her feet after her first husband nearly destroyed her. We understood each other's damage, I guess. What happened? Between you and Linda, I mean, Amanda." Jake's voice was quiet but steady. "When she died, Linda blamed me for not protecting her. Said if I'd tried harder to get Amanda away from Marcus, she'd still be alive. Maybe she was right. Maybe I could have done more, moved faster, been smarter about it." Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for this man who carried so much guilt. "You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved." "I know, I was that person 6 months ago. Were you?" Jake asked, studying her face. "Or were you just someone who'd been convinced she didn't deserve saving?" The question hit deeper than Sarah expected. Looking back, she could see how Marcus had systematically dismantled her sense of self-worth, convinced her that she was lucky he tolerated her flaws, that no one else would ever love someone as damaged and difficult as she was. But underneath all that conditioning, hadn't there been a part of her that was screaming to get out? A knock at the cabin door interrupted her thoughts. Jake immediately tensed, his hand moving instinctively to something concealed under his sweater. But then a woman's voice called out in accented English, "Jake, it's Elena. We need to talk." Jake relaxed and opened the door to reveal a woman in her early 50s with prematurely grey hair and intelligent dark eyes. She was small, but carried herself with the kind of contained energy that suggested inner strength forged by hardship. In her hands was a large canvas bag that clinked softly as she moved. "Elena Vasquez," Jake said by way of introduction. "Elena, this is Sarah." Elena's gaze moved immediately to Sarah's face, taking in the fading bruises and healing cuts with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen such injuries before. "Dios mío," she murmured. "He really did a number on you, didn't he?" "You've seen worse?" Sarah asked. "I've seen what Marcus Rivera is capable of." Elena set her bag on the table and began unpacking it. Uniforms from an upscale catering company, name badges, and what looked like small electronic devices. "My daughter Sophia was with him for 8 months, 3 years ago. She was studying journalism at UCLA, working part-time at one of his dealerships to pay for school." Elena's hands moved efficiently as she spoke, but Sarah could see the tension in her shoulders. Sophia was smart, independent, planning to be an investigative reporter. But Marcus saw that independence as a challenge. Within 2 months, he'd convinced her to drop out of school and move in with him. Said he'd support her while she found herself. What happened to her? Sarah asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. She disappeared one night after confronting Marcus about some financial documents she'd seen in his office. Police said she'd probably run off with some boyfriend, that girls like Sophia were unpredictable. But I found her car 3 weeks later, submerged in a canal near the Mexico border, empty. The cabin fell silent, except for the soft sounds of Elena's preparations. Sarah watched her methodically check each electronic device, her movements precise, despite the obvious pain the story caused her. "They never found Sophia's body," Elena continued. "Never opened an official investigation. Marcus had an alibi. He was at a charity gala with 200 witnesses. But I knew he'd killed her, just like I knew he'd kill again if no one stopped him." "So you got a job with his catering company," Jake said. "Took me 18 months to work my way into their regular rotation for Marcus's private events. I've been inside that house dozens of times, learned every detail of his routine, his security, his habits." Elena looked up from the devices she'd been testing. "Tonight is our only chance. After tomorrow, everything changes." Sarah frowned.
"What do you mean?"
Elena and Jake exchanged a look that suggested they'd been planning to tell her something she wouldn't like. "The federal investigation is wrapping up," Jake said. "They're planning to arrest Marcus on Monday morning. Once he's in federal custody, he'll be untouchable. His lawyers will negotiate a plea deal. He'll serve a few years in minimum security. And when he gets out, he'll be even more careful about covering his tracks. This party tonight isn't just a social gathering," Elena added. "It's Marcus's farewell celebration. He knows the arrest is coming, has known for weeks. If his assets have already been moved offshore, and he has a private jet fueled and ready at Burbank Airport. If we don't stop him tonight, he'll disappear into some non-extradition country and spend the rest of his life as a wealthy expatriate." The weight of the timeline settled over Sarah like physical pressure. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about preventing Marcus from escaping justice entirely. "Show her the uniforms," Jake said. Elena pulled out 2 identical sets of black pants and white shirts bearing the logo of Premier Events Catering. The fabric was high quality, professional, designed to let service staff blend invisibly into upscale environments. "You'll enter through the service entrance at 5:30, just as the setup is finishing," Elena explained. "I'll be the head server for the event, so no one will question my bringing additional staff. The key is to move with purpose, carry trays, look busy, stay invisible." She handed Sarah a small earpiece. "We'll be able to communicate through these, but keep conversation to a minimum. Security cameras cover most of the house, but there are blind spots I've identified near the service areas and in the upstairs hallway leading to Marcus's office." Jake took the other earpiece and clipped it inside his collar with practiced ease. "What about the safe?" "Still in the same location, behind the Picasso in his private study. Combination is still Amanda's birthday, just like she told her friend." Marcus is sentimental about his trophies. Elena's voice carried a note of disgust. But there's a problem. Sarah's stomach clenched. What kind of problem? Marcus has been paranoid lately. More security cameras, motion sensors in areas that used to be clear. And he's hired additional muscle for tonight. Not the usual rent-a-cops, but serious people. Professional bodyguards? Jake frowned. How many? At least 4, maybe 6. Ex-military types, the kind who shoot first and ask questions later. They'll be dressed as guests, but they'll be armed and alert. Eleanor's expression was grim. I think Marcus suspects something. Maybe not about us specifically, but he knows his time is running out. The cabin fell quiet as they absorbed this new complication. Sarah found herself thinking about Amanda's video, about the other women who died because Marcus Rivera was allowed to operate with impunity. How many more would there be if he escaped to some tropical paradise with unlimited money and no oversight? We proceed as planned, Jake said finally. Additional security just means we need to be smarter, more careful. The mission doesn't change. Elena nodded, but Sarah could see the worry in her eyes. There's something else. Marcus has been asking questions about his regular catering staff, wanting background checks on everyone. I think he's planning to eliminate anyone who might have seen too much. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Marcus wasn't just planning to escape, he was planning to clean house first, removing any potential witnesses to his crimes. All the more reason to end this tonight, Jake said. Elena, you have the broadcast equipment ready? She pulled a small laptop from her bag, along with several USB drives and what looked like a sophisticated router. Everything's here. Once we access Marcus's network, I can override every screen in the house simultaneously. The presentation will autoplay on all devices, televisions, computers, tablets, even guests' phones if they're connected to his Wi-Fi. Sarah studied the equipment, impressed despite her fear. How long will it take to set up? 5 minutes once I reach his main server, which is in a closet next to his office. But someone needs to keep watch while I work, and someone needs to be in the office getting the evidence from his safe. The division of labor was becoming clear. Elena would handle the technical aspects, Jake would watch for security, and Sarah would have to face her demons by going back into Marcus's private sanctuary, the room where he'd shown her his collection of photographs from previous relationships, where he'd made her feel like just another acquisition to be catalogued and controlled. I can do it, Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. I know that office better than anyone. I can get in and out fast. Jake studied her carefully. Are you sure? Because once we're inside that house, there's no backing out. If something goes wrong, if we get caught, we're on our own. Sarah thought about the video Amanda had left behind, about Elena's missing daughter, about all the women whose stories would never be told if Marcus escaped justice. She thought about the 4 hours she'd spent on that highway, watching a parade of indifference drive past her suffering. She thought about the choice between living as a victim or dying as someone who'd fought back. I'm sure, she said. Elena handed her a small camera disguised as a pen and a portable hard drive the size of a thumb. Document everything in the safe. Photos, videos, any physical evidence. The hard drive will copy files automatically when you plug it into his computer. As they finalized the details of their plan, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. For 6 months, Marcus had controlled every aspect of her life through fear and manipulation. Tonight, for the first time since she'd met him, she would be the one with the power. She would be the one with secrets and plans and the element of surprise. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. By mid-afternoon, they were ready to leave for Los Angeles. Jake loaded Honey into a different trailer, this one unmarked and unremarkable, while Elena double-checked their equipment one final time. The plan was elegantly simple. Infiltrate the party, gather the evidence, broadcast Marcus's crimes to his most powerful allies, and escape in the chaos that followed. Of course, Sarah knew from her marketing background that the simplest plans were often the most likely to go catastrophically wrong. As they drove south toward the city, Sarah watched the landscape change from rural farmland to suburban sprawl to urban density. Somewhere ahead of them, Marcus Rivera was preparing for what he thought would be his victory celebration. He had no idea that 3 ghosts from his past were coming to collect a debt that was 13 months overdue. The sun was setting behind the smog layer when Jake's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and his expression darkened. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "Elena's contact at the catering company. There's been a change to tonight's guest list." Jake's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Marcus added 6 names at the last minute. All women, all young, all arriving separately from the main group. Sarah's blood ran cold. "He's selecting his next victim." "Or victims," Jake said grimly. "Looks like we're not just stopping Marcus from escaping justice. We're stopping a massacre." The Malibu Coast Road curved through million-dollar real estate like a ribbon of asphalt threading between heaven and earth. On the left, mansions perched on cliffs overlooking the Pacific. On the right, the Santa Monica Mountains rose into the gathering dusk. Sarah pressed her face to the passenger window of Elena's catering van, watching the familiar landmarks of her former prison approach with each mile. Marcus Rivera's beach house sat on 3 acres of prime oceanfront property, a modern architectural monument to wealth and power. Glass walls offered panoramic views of the Pacific, while strategically placed lighting would soon transform the structure into a glowing beacon visible for miles. Tonight, those lights would illuminate more than Marcus had ever intended. "Vehicle count," Jake's voice crackled through their earpieces from his position in the hills above the property. He'd taken up an overwatch position with binoculars and a long-range radio, coordinating their operation like the military missions he'd run overseas. 12 cars in the main lot, including the Porsche. 2 security vehicles by the service entrance. I count 4 guards on exterior patrol. Eleanor guided the van down the service road that wound behind the house, past carefully manicured gardens that had cost more than most people's homes. Sarah's hands were steady as she adjusted her catering uniform, but her heart hammered against her ribs. The last time she'd been here, she'd crawled through a bathroom window to escape. Now she was walking back through the front door. "Remember," Elena murmured as they pulled up to the service entrance, "we're just part of the staff. Invisible, efficient, forgettable. Sarah, keep your head down until we're inside. If any of the regular guards recognize you, they won't," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. "Marcus never let me interact with the staff. I was kept upstairs most of the time, like a shameful secret." The service entrance buzzed with controlled chaos as Elena's catering team finished their setup. Servers in identical uniforms moved between the kitchen and dining areas, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres and champagne glasses. The familiar ballet of high-end event service, where every movement was choreographed to maintain the illusion of effortless elegance. Elena had been right about the security guards. 2 bored-looking men in ill-fitting suits sat at a small table near the kitchen entrance, more interested in their phones than the parade of catering staff around them. They barely glanced up as Sarah and Elena entered with armloads of linens and serving equipment. "Kitchen team, this is Elena," she announced to the assembled staff with the authority of someone who'd run countless events. "We're running behind schedule, so I need everyone to be focused. Jennifer and Marcus will be handling the upstairs service area tonight." Sarah nodded at the use of her cover name, grateful for Elena's attention to detail. Around them, the kitchen hummed with professional efficiency, sauces being plated, garnishes arranged, wine being opened and decanted. The kind of expensive catering that Marcus's guests expected, without ever thinking about the small army of people required to create their seamless experience. Through the service corridor, Sarah could hear the sound of arriving guests, expensive cars on gravel, voices raised in the practiced bonhomie of political networking, the clink of crystal glasses. Marcus was in his element, playing the role of successful businessman entertaining his influential friends. None of them knew they were attending his going-away party. "First wave of VIPs just arrived," Jake's voice reported through their earpieces. City Councilman Bradley, real estate developer Morrison, and 3 women I don't recognize. Young, well-dressed, arriving separately just like we suspected. Sarah's stomach clenched. Those women had no idea what they were walking into. In Marcus's twisted mind, tonight wasn't just about celebrating his upcoming escape, it was about selecting his final victims before disappearing forever. Women who would vanish into his offshore exile, or who might never leave this house at all. Eleanor handed Sarah a tray of champagne glasses and nodded toward the main staircase. Time to go upstairs. Remember, you're just another server. If anyone asks, you're refilling the bar in the upper lounge. The main level of Marcus's house was exactly as Sarah remembered. All glass and steel and intimidating modern art, designed to make visitors feel small and impressed in equal measure. Guests clustered in conversation groups, their voices a low murmur of deal-making and social positioning. She recognized several faces from Marcus's business circle, people who'd smiled and complimented her when she'd been his trophy girlfriend, never asking why she seemed so nervous or why her makeup was sometimes a little too heavy. Marcus himself stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, resplendent in a perfectly tailored black suit. At 52, he was still handsome in the way that money and personal trainers could maintain, his silver hair styled to perfection and his smile radiating confidence. He was telling some story to a group of admirers, gesticulating with a crystal tumbler of what Sarah knew would be his preferred single malt scotch. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded room. Sarah's breath caught, waiting for recognition, for the explosion of rage that would end their mission before it began. But Marcus's gaze passed over her without the slightest flicker of acknowledgement. To him, she was exactly what Elena had promised, invisible service staff beneath his notice or concern. The realization was both liberating and infuriating. For 6 months, she'd lived in terror of this man, believing he saw and controlled everything in her world. But he couldn't even recognize her when she was standing 20 feet away in a different context. Marcus Rivera was powerful and dangerous, but he was also fundamentally limited by his own arrogance and blindness. Sarah moved through the crowd with her tray, serving champagne and collecting empty glasses, while her eyes mapped the room's security cameras and exit routes. 2 of Marcus's new bodyguards were positioned near the main entrance, their bulky frames obvious despite their attempt to blend in. A 3rd stood at the base of the staircase leading to the upper levels, effectively controlling access to Marcus's private areas. Upper-level access is blocked, she whispered into her collar microphone while pretending to adjust her uniform. Copy that, Jake responded. Elena, what's your status on the technical setup? Kitchen network accessed. I'm showing green lights on all systems. Give me 10 more minutes to finish the presentation upload. Sarah continued her circuit of the main floor, noting the locations of guests and security personnel. The young women Jake had spotted were indeed here, 3 beautiful girls who looked to be in their early 20s, all seeming slightly out of place among the older, more established crowd. They stayed close to the bar, accepting drinks from attentive servers while Marcus's associates made conversation with the practiced skill of predators sizing up prey. One of the girls, a stunning blonde who couldn't be older than 22, kept glancing around nervously. Something about her body language reminded Sarah of herself 6 months ago, excited by the attention and luxury, but subconsciously aware that something wasn't quite right about the situation. As Sarah passed near their group, she caught fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. Special guests tonight, one of Marcus's business partners was saying. Marcus has been looking forward to getting to know you better. The house has such beautiful private areas upstairs, another man added. Maybe later Marcus can give you a personal tour. The blonde girl smiled politely, but Sarah saw her grip tighten on her champagne glass. Whatever story these men had told to lure these women here, the reality was becoming uncomfortably clear. Jake, Sarah whispered urgently, We need to move faster. Those women are in immediate danger. Understood. Elena, how much longer do you need? 5 minutes. The presentation is huge. All of Amanda's files, plus everything we've compiled on the other victims. I want to make sure it streams perfectly to every device in the house. Sarah forced herself to keep moving, keep playing her role, even as every instinct screamed at her to grab those young women and run. But rushing now would only get them all killed. Their plan was the only chance any of them had. Additional security just arrived, Jake reported. 2 more vehicles, 4 men. Military bearing, professional equipment. Sarah, you need to get to that office now. The guard at the staircase had moved away from his post to speak with one of the new arrivals, leaving a narrow window of opportunity. Sarah abandoned her tray on a side table and slipped up the stairs with the practiced invisibility Elena had taught her. The upper level was darker, lit only by recessed ceiling fixtures that cast pools of warm light in the carpeted hallway. Marcus's private office sat at the end of the corridor, behind a door of polished mahogany that she'd passed hundreds of times during her captivity. Sarah had only been inside twice, once when Marcus had shown off his collection of mementos from previous relationships, and once when he'd forced her to watch while he burned photographs of her friends and family. The door was unlocked, exactly as Elena had predicted. Marcus's arrogance extended to his private spaces. Who would dare violate his sanctuary? The office was a shrine to wealth and power, lined with first-edition books Marcus had never read and expensive art he'd bought for its investment value rather than beauty. Behind the massive desk, a Picasso worth millions hung in a gilt frame. Sarah approached it with hands that trembled only slightly, remembering Amanda's voice from the video. The combination is my birthday. The bastard uses his victims' birthdays for everything important to him. The painting swung aside on hidden hinges, revealing a steel safe built into the wall. Sarah punched in the numbers Elena had given her, Amanda's birth date, and held her breath until the lock clicked open. Inside was a collection that made her stomach lurch. Photographs of women in various states of distress, some clearly taken without their knowledge. Personal items, jewelry, driver's licenses, even what looked like locks of hair. Video recordings labeled with women's names and dates. And in the center of it all, a beautiful diamond engagement ring that could only have belonged to Amanda Thompson. Sarah worked quickly, photographing everything with the pen camera Elena had given her, while the portable hard drive copied files from Marcus's computer. The evidence was overwhelming, not just of the money laundering operation, but of systematic predation spanning years. Marcus had documented his crimes like a collector cataloging his conquests, never imagining that his arrogance would become the instrument of his destruction. "Upload complete!" Elena's voice crackled through the earpiece. "Ready to broadcast on your signal." "Almost finished here," Sarah whispered back, closing the safe and repositioning the Picasso. "Give me 30 seconds to get clear." As she moved toward the office door, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Heavy, purposeful, approaching fast. Sarah's heart hammered as she realized she'd lingered too long. Security was making their rounds, and she was trapped in Marcus's private office with a hard drive full of incriminating evidence. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. Sarah looked around frantically for another exit, but the office had only one way in or out. The windows faced a 3-story drop to the rocks below, not survivable even if she could get them open. She was trapped, and if those guards came through that door, everything they'd worked for would end in disaster. The door handle turned slowly. In desperation, Sarah pressed herself against the wall behind the door, praying that whoever entered wouldn't see her in the shadows. The door swung open, and 2 large men in expensive suits stepped into the room. Professional security, just as Elena had warned, the kind who shot first and disposed of bodies later. "Boss wants a complete sweep of the upper level," one of them was saying. "Check every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot." "You really think someone's trying to infiltrate tonight?" the second man asked, moving toward the desk. "Rivera's paranoid as hell." Says he's got enemies who might try something before he leaves the country. Better safe than sorry. They were thorough in their search, checking behind furniture and inside closets with professional efficiency. Sarah remained frozen against the wall, knowing that discovery meant death. These weren't the lazy guards from downstairs. These were killers who would eliminate any threat to their employer without hesitation. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the guards finished their sweep and moved toward the door. Sarah prepared to slip out behind them, but the first man stopped and turned back toward the room. "Wait," he said, his hand moving to the weapon concealed under his jacket. Something's not right. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Had she left some trace of her presence? Moved something out of place? Failed to close the safe properly? The guard was staring directly at Picasso, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "The painting," he said slowly. "It's not hanging straight." The guard's hand hovered over his weapon as he stared at the slightly askew Picasso. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the shadows behind the door, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain they could hear it. Every muscle in her body was coiled for fight or flight, though neither option offered much hope against two armed professionals. "You're being paranoid." "Collins," the second guard said, but he was already moving toward the painting. "It's probably been like that all night." Collins shook his head. "I've been in this room a dozen times. Rivera's obsessive about everything being perfect. That painting's never been crooked." The second guard reached for the frame, and Sarah knew their mission was about to end in disaster. Once they discovered the safe had been accessed, the house would go into lockdown. Marcus would escape, the evidence would disappear, and those three young women downstairs would vanish forever. That's when the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing the office in red shadows, but for crucial seconds, the guards were disoriented. Sarah heard Elena's voice crackling through her earpiece. "System override initiated." Jake, now would be good. Somewhere in the house, an alarm began wailing, not the simple beep of a security system, but the sustained shriek of a fire suppression activation. Through the office windows, Sarah could see spotlights blazing to life across the property as Jake's contingency plan went into effect. "What the hell?" Collins started, but his words were cut off by an explosion that shook the entire house. Not close enough to cause real damage, but loud and convincing enough to trigger every security protocol Marcus had installed. "Bomb threat!" The second guard shouted into his radio. "All units respond to the north perimeter." Both men rushed from the office, their focus shifted from internal threats to external attack. Sarah waited until their footsteps faded down the hallway before emerging from her hiding spot. Through her earpiece, she could hear Jake coordinating the diversion with military precision. Smoke charges deployed on the beach access road. Emergency services en route, due to automatic fire department notification. "You've got maybe 10 minutes before this place is crawling with real cops." Sarah ran for the staircase, but as she reached the main level, she realized the house had descended into chaos. Guests were clustered near the windows, pointing at the smoke rising from the perimeter, while Marcus's security team shouted contradictory orders. The professional veneer of the evening had cracked, revealing the panic underneath. Marcus himself stood in the center of the main room, his face a mask of controlled fury as he barked orders into a satellite phone. Even in crisis, he was trying to maintain command, but Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. His carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "Elena, where are you?" Sarah whispered into her microphone. "Server station near the kitchen, ready to initiate broadcast." "But Sarah, those three women, Marcus's people, are trying to move them to the safe room upstairs." "We're about to lose them." Sarah's blood ran cold. Marcus had built a secure panic room on the upper level, ostensibly for protection during emergencies. But she knew its real purpose, a soundproof space where screams couldn't escape and bodies could be disposed of without witnesses. Through the crowd, she could see Marcus's associates surrounding the three young women, their earlier charm replaced by firm insistence. "For your safety," they were saying, "just until we understand what's happening." The blonde girl, who'd seemed nervous earlier, was now openly frightened. backing away from the men trying to guide her toward the stairs. "I want to leave," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I want to call my parents." "That's not possible right now," Marcus's business partner replied smoothly. "Communications are down for security reasons. We'll have you safely out of here soon." Sarah watched the girl's face change as understanding dawned. This wasn't protection, this was kidnapping. But the other guests were too focused on the explosions and smoke to pay attention to what was happening right in front of them. "Elena, start the broadcast," Sarah said urgently. "Do it now, but you're not clear yet. Do it now!" Every screen in the house flickered simultaneously. Televisions, tablets, phones, even the digital displays on kitchen appliances. For a moment there was silence as guests stared in confusion at their devices. Then Amanda Thompson's face appeared on every display, and her recorded voice filled the house with crystal clarity. "If you're watching this, then Marcus Rivera probably succeeded in killing me." The effect was instantaneous and electric. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Marcus's face went white as he stared at the nearest screen, watching his dead victim speak directly to his assembled guests. "My name is Amanda Thompson, and I was murdered by the man hosting this party. But before I died, I gathered evidence of his crimes, evidence that implicates many of you who are watching right now." The presentation that Eleanor had crafted was devastating in its thoroughness. Amanda's testimony was interspersed with financial documents showing the money laundering operation, surveillance footage of Marcus with various women who had later died under suspicious circumstances, and photographs from his private safe showing trophies taken from his victims. But the most damning evidence was Marcus's own voice, recorded during phone conversations Amanda had secretly captured. His casual discussion of disposing of problems, his instructions to associates about covering up inconvenient deaths, his cold calculation about which politicians and judges were sufficiently compromised to ensure their cooperation. "Oh my God," someone gasped. "That's Councilman Bradley's voice on that recording." Indeed, several of the guests were hearing their own voices played back to them, discussing bribes and cover-ups with the casual tone of routine business. The presentation didn't just expose Marcus, it revealed the entire network of corruption that had protected him for years. Marcus finally found his voice, shouting over the audio from the screens. "Shut it off! Shut everything off now!" But Elena had designed the system to be unstoppable once initiated. The presentation continued to play on every device, broadcasting to phones that were automatically uploading the content to social media accounts and cloud storage. Even if Marcus's people could regain control of the house systems, the evidence was already spreading beyond their reach. The three young women used the chaos to break free from their handlers, running toward the main entrance as Marcus's associates found themselves surrounded by increasingly hostile guests, politicians and business leaders who had thought they were attending a private celebration suddenly realized they were starring in their own destruction. "This is Senator Morrison, authorizing payment to the Rivera organization." Amanda's voice continued from the speakers. "Wire transfer completed to Cayman account ending in 7749. Senator Morrison himself was standing 10 feet from Sarah, his face ashen as he listened to his own words condemning him. Around the room, similar scenes played out as Marcus's web of corruption was laid bare for everyone to see. Marcus grabbed one of his bodyguards and screamed instructions Sarah couldn't hear over the audio. The man nodded and began moving through the crowd toward the server room where Elena was positioned. Sarah realized with horror that Marcus had figured out where the broadcast was originating from. "Elena, get out of there! They're coming for you!" "Almost finished." Elena's voice was strained but determined. "The final segment is uploading now. The complete files on Sophia, Amanda, and the other victims. Once this goes live, Marcus can't bury it even if he kills all of us." Through the chaos, Sarah saw Marcus himself pushing through the crowd, his handsome face twisted with rage. He was heading directly for the kitchen area, probably carrying a weapon, certainly planning to silence Eleanor permanently. Sarah didn't think, she just moved. Grabbing a heavy crystal vase from a side table, she intercepted Marcus near the main staircase. For a moment, they stood face to face for the first time since her escape, and she saw recognition finally dawn in his eyes. "You!" he snarled. "You did this." "Amanda did this," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I'm just delivering her message." Marcus lunged for her, but Sarah was ready. 6 months of living in fear had taught her to anticipate violence, and Jake's crash course in self-defense had given her the tools to respond. She swung the vase with all her strength, connecting with Marcus's temple in a shower of crystal fragments. He staggered, but didn't fall, his hand moving to the gun concealed beneath his jacket. That's when Jake Thompson appeared like an avenging angel, moving through the crowd with the efficiency of a trained soldier. His punch connected with Marcus's jaw, with the force of 13 months of grief and rage, dropping the man who had killed his daughter. "Broadcast complete," Elena announced through their earpieces. "Every file uploaded to multiple news outlets and law enforcement agencies. It's done." Around them, the carefully orchestrated world of Marcus Rivera was collapsing in real time. Guests were fleeing toward the exits, phones pressed to their ears, as they called lawyers and damage control specialists. The 3 young women had reached safety outside, where genuine emergency responders were arriving to deal with Jake's diversionary explosions. But Marcus wasn't finished. As sirens wailed in the distance and his empire crumbled around him, he struggled to his feet with blood streaming from his nose. In his hand was a small pistol, and his eyes held the desperate fury of a cornered animal. "If I'm going down," he gasped, pointing the weapon at Sarah, "you're coming with me." The shot that rang out echoed through the house like a final period at the end of a long, terrible sentence. But it wasn't Marcus who fired. The gunshot echoed through Marcus Rivera's collapsing empire like thunder, but it wasn't his finger that had pulled the trigger. Standing in the doorway to the kitchen, smoke still curling from the service weapon in her hands, was Detective Rachel Moreno of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, Elena's daughter Sophia. Very much alive and very much a cop, Marcus's pistol clattered to the marble floor as he clutched his shoulder, his face a mask of shock and pain. Around the room, his fleeing guests froze as they realized they were now witnesses to an officer-involved shooting. The careful choreography of their escape was interrupted by the sudden presence of actual law enforcement, LAPD. "Nobody move," Sophia shouted, her badge now visible on a chain around her neck. "This is Detective Moreno, and this house is now a crime scene." Sarah stared in amazement as the woman she'd been told was dead 3 years ago took control of the situation with professional efficiency. Sofia Vasquez, now Sophia Moreno, was older than the college student in the photographs Elena had shown them, her face harder and more weathered, but unmistakably alive. "Jake, stand down," Sophia commanded, though her weapon remained trained on Marcus. "Sarah Martinez, step away from the suspect." "Elena Vasquez, exit the kitchen area with your hands visible." Jake raised his hand slowly, his eyes fixed on the young woman who'd supposedly been another of Marcus's victims. "You're supposed to be dead," he said quietly. "That was the idea," Sophia replied, not taking her eyes off Marcus. "My death was the only way to get close enough to gather evidence that would stick in court. Took 3 years of deep cover work, but we finally have everything we need." Elena emerged from the kitchen area, her face a mixture of relief and maternal fury. "Mija, you couldn't have told your own mother you were alive. 3 years I mourned for you." "I'm sorry, Mama," Sophia said, genuine pain in her voice. But if even one person had known the truth, Marcus would have discovered it. His reach extended into every level of law enforcement. This was the only way. As if summoned by her words, the house began filling with federal agents wearing FBI windbreakers. They moved with the coordinated precision of a long-planned operation, securing exits and separating witnesses with practiced efficiency. Sarah realized this had never been just Jake's revenge mission. It had been a federal sting operation, years in the making. Agent Sarah Chen, FBI, said a woman who approached their group, showing her credentials. Detective Moreno, we heard your shot. Status on the suspect? Marcus Rivera, wounded and secured, Sophia reported. Attempted murder of a civilian witness. The civilian is unharmed. Agent Chen nodded and spoke into a radio. Medical to the main room for a GSW. Also need crime scene photographers for evidence documentation. Marcus, still clutching his bleeding shoulder, looked around at the federal agents with growing comprehension. This was a setup, he gasped. You've been planning this for years. Actually, Agent Chen said, pulling out a thick folder, we've been investigating you for 5 years. Ever since the death of Jennifer Walsh in San Diego, your first victim that we can prove. Detective Moreno's undercover work just gave us the final pieces we needed. Sarah remembered that name from the files in Marcus's safe. Jennifer Walsh, 2019, listed alongside photos and personal effects like a museum catalogue. How many women had died while law enforcement built their case? The federal money laundering charges were always secondary, Agent Chen continued. What we really wanted was evidence of the murders. Thanks to tonight's operation, we now have Marcus Rivera's own voice confessing to 4 homicides. Plus the physical evidence Detective Moreno helped us collect over 3 years of surveillance. Jake stepped forward, his weathered face showing a mixture of relief and lingering grief. What about Amanda? What about my daughter? Agent Chen's expression softened. Mr. Thompson, I know this has been incredibly difficult. Amanda's death was the catalyst for this entire investigation. When Detective Moreno made contact with us after her staged death, she specifically mentioned your daughter's case as connected to the Rivera operation. Amanda was building her own case against Marcus, Sophia added, finally lowering her weapon as medical personnel arrived to treat Marcus's wound. She'd gathered enough evidence to bring him down, which is why he had to eliminate her. But she was smart. She'd already shared everything with a secure server that we've now accessed. Sarah watched as paramedics worked on Marcus, his expensive suit cut away to reveal the shoulder wound that had effectively ended his reign of terror. The man who had seemed so powerful, so untouchable just hours ago, now looked pathetic and small, surrounded by federal agents reading him his rights. The 3 women who were here tonight, Sarah said urgently. Are they safe? Secured and being interviewed by victim advocates, Agent Chen confirmed. Based on conversations we recorded tonight, they were definitely being set up as Marcus's final victims before his planned escape. Your intervention likely saved their lives. Around them, the house continued to fill with law enforcement personnel. Crime scene photographers documented Marcus's office and safe, while evidence technicians collected the physical trophies he'd kept from his victims. The carefully curated image of wealth and success was being methodically dismantled by people who understood the difference between justice and revenge. What happens now? Elena asked, moving to embrace her daughter properly for the first time in 3 years. To Marcus, to all of us? Agent Chen consulted her folder. Marcus Rivera will face federal charges for racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy. The state will file murder charges in 4 jurisdictions for the deaths we can prove. With tonight's evidence and Detective Moreno's testimony, he's looking at life without parole. Minimum. What about the guests who fled? Jake asked. Some of them were clearly part of his network. Already being rounded up, Agent Chen smiled grimly. Amazing how fast federal agents can move when they have recorded confessions. By morning, we'll have arrested 12 city officials, 6 state politicians, and 3 federal judges. This wasn't just about stopping Marcus. It was about dismantling the entire corruption network that enabled him. Sarah felt a strange sense of displacement watching justice finally unfold around her. For months, she'd lived in terror of Marcus Rivera, believing him to be untouchable and all-powerful. Now he was just another criminal in handcuffs, bleeding and defeated. The man who had controlled every aspect of her life was being reduced to evidence tags and federal case numbers. "Ms. Martinez," Agent Chen approached her with a gentle expression, "I need to inform you that you'll be called as a witness in both the federal and state proceedings. But I also want you to know that the Bureau has resources available to help you rebuild your life: relocation assistance, job placement, counseling services." "What about Marcus's assets?" Sarah asked. "He stole months of my life, destroyed my career, isolated me from everyone I cared about. Civil asset forfeiture will seize all property connected to his criminal enterprises. There will likely be a victim compensation fund established, though I know money can't undo the trauma you experienced." As Marcus was loaded onto a stretcher for transport to the hospital under heavy guard, he made eye contact with Sarah one final time. She expected to see rage or threats, but what she found in his gaze was something far more disturbing: complete bewilderment. Even now, facing life in prison, Marcus Rivera couldn't understand how his victims had found the strength to fight back. "He really thought we were nothing," Sarah said quietly. "Just disposable objects for his entertainment. That's what made him sloppy," Sophia replied, holstering her weapon. "Predators like Marcus become convinced of their own invincibility. They stop taking precautions because they can't imagine their victims as actual people with agency and intelligence." Jake walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific, where just hours ago Marcus had been entertaining his corrupt associates. Now the beach was lit by emergency vehicle strobes, and the mansion that had been a monument to wealth and power was crawling with investigators cataloging evidence of systematic evil. "Amanda would have been proud of tonight," he said quietly. "She always believed in justice, even when it seemed impossible." Agent Chen joined him at the window. "Mr. Thompson, there's something else you should know. The FBI has been in contact with your ex-wife, Linda. She's been informed about tonight's operation and Amanda's role in bringing Marcus down. She wanted me to tell you that she's sorry for blaming you, sorry for the things she said after Amanda's death." Jake's weathered hands pressed against the glass, and Sarah could see tears reflecting the emergency lights outside. "Grief makes people say things they don't mean. Linda was hurting, looking for someone to blame. I never held it against her. She'd like to see you when you're ready. She said Amanda would have wanted her parents to find their way back to each other." The investigation continued around them, but Sarah found herself thinking about the 4 hours she'd spent on that highway, watching car after car drive past her suffering. Tonight had proven that there were still people willing to stop, willing to risk everything to help a stranger in need. Jake Thompson had saved her life, but more than that, he'd shown her that goodness still existed in a world that often seemed designed to reward cruelty. "Elena," Sarah said, turning to the woman who'd risked everything to expose Marcus's crimes. "What will you do now? With Sophia alive, with this all over?" Elena smiled through her tears, still holding her daughter close. "I think I'm done with catering fancy parties for rich criminals. Maybe it's time to start a real business, something that helps people instead of enabling monsters." "And you, Sarah?" Jake asked. "What comes next?" Sarah looked around the room where she'd been held prisoner for 6 months, now transformed into a crime scene that would finally bring justice for Marcus's victims. The terror and helplessness she'd felt in this house were being replaced by something she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. "I want to go home," she said simply. "Back to Florida to my family. I want to remember who I was before Marcus Rivera and figure out who I can become after him." Agent Chen handed her a business card. "The Victim Services Coordinator will help arrange travel and contact your family. They've already been briefed on the situation and are eager to see you." As they prepared to leave the house, Sarah took one last look around the main room where Marcus had entertained his corrupt associates. The screens that had broadcast Amanda's testimony were now dark, but the evidence they'd revealed was spreading across the internet faster than any damage control could contain it. By morning, Marcus Rivera's name would be synonymous with predatory violence and systematic corruption, but more importantly, the names of his victims would be remembered too. Amanda Thompson, Sophia Vasquez, Jennifer Walsh, and all the others who had suffered at his hands would finally have their stories told truthfully and completely. Outside, the Malibu air was clean and cool, washed by ocean breezes that carried away the stench of corruption that had permeated the house. Emergency responders were packing up their equipment, and the last of the arrested guests were being loaded into federal transport vehicles. Jake's truck sat in the same spot where he'd parked it hours ago, but the horse trailer was gone. Elena had arranged for Honey to be transported to a safe location during the operation. The Palomino mare that had saved other discarded creatures would be waiting for her owner's return. "Jake," Sarah said as they walked toward the truck, "thank you for stopping on that highway, for listening to my story, for believing I was worth saving." Jake's pale blue eyes met hers in the emergency vehicle lighting. "I didn't save you, Sarah. You saved yourself. I just gave you a ride to where you could do it." As they drove away from Marcus Rivera's house for the final time, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with the worst day of her life, beaten, abandoned, ignored by dozens of passing strangers. But it had led to the best night of her life, justice delivered, truth revealed, and the knowledge that she was stronger than any force that tried to destroy her. The highway stretched ahead of them, lit by headlights and starlight, carrying them toward whatever came next. But for the first time in months, Sarah wasn't afraid of the future. She'd walked through hell and emerged with something Marcus Rivera could never take away from her: the unshakable knowledge of her own worth. Behind them, the lights of Malibu faded into memory. But ahead lay the promise of home, family, and a life rebuilt on foundations of truth rather than fear. The woman who had once sat broken on a highway shoulder, watching the world pass her by, was gone forever. In her place was someone who would never again be invisible to those who mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.